Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to start the next session of talks. Our first speaker for this session is Dr. Carmen Charlton. Dr. Charlton is a board-certified clinical microbiologist who completed her PhD in bacteriology at McMaster University in Hamilton, followed by additional training at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Charlton.
Hello, everyone. I think I've lost my sound. So I'm going to assume that thank you very much for the nice introduction. And I continue on with her. Okay. So I wanted to start with, these are my disclosures, to look at new and re-emerging infections. And you can see this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it does show a lot of new and old infections that are coming up in different geographical locations than we would typically see them. And so what we're seeing is a redistribution of a lot of these pathogens. For example, there's now been autochthonous spread of dengue virus through mosquito vectors that are seen in Spain and France and Italy. And this is now endemic spread within those countries where typically we don't see dengue in those areas. For monkeypox is also another pathogen that we look at, mostly because it has an asymptomatic time point where there is no symptoms. So the patients are asymptomatic, but there could potentially be a viremia during that period. And so all of these pathogens that I've highlighted all have an asymptomatic period where there could be the pathogen in the blood leading to a potential transfusion event. The other one that we're seeing periodically is Ebola. Most recently, there was an outbreak in both the Congo and Tanzania. And again, this is a significant one for asymptomatic period where there would be viremia in the blood. The two that I'm going to focus on today are primarily babesia and then malaria. One, because malaria has now been starting to come up in areas of the country that we haven't seen it in a long time. And babesia because through climate change, the ticks are slowly emerging and moving into new locations. So first, babesia. With climate change, it's really allowed for the movement of many arthropods into new geographic areas. And the ixodes can transmit several diseases, including babesia, which I'll talk about primarily today, but also the same ticks can transmit anaplasma and Powassan virus as well. The main point of these ones, they have asymptomatic incubation periods and sometimes are completely asymptomatic in healthy donors. So babesia can be transfusion transmitted. Many individuals are asymptomatic, and that transfusion transmitted babesia infectious period can persist for up to 2 years. And so that's a very long time to have potential parasitemia where you have the parasite in the blood, and that could potentially be transfusion transmitted. So the overall mortality is about 20%. And those with impaired immune systems is a very high mortality rate. CBS, because of this, indefinitely defers donors with a history of babesiosis, but this is different than what the FDA does, and they allow re-entry if the NAT is negative for greater than 2 years after a positive test. So Ixodes scapularis, we know, is moving, and because of climate change, areas are getting warmer, and the tick is able to move into these geographic areas where it wasn't previously. So if we look at the let's grab my laser pointer here. If we look at in the upper Midwest, you can see the location of travel is definitely into the Canadian regions, and in the Northeast, up into the Great Lakes, as well as Ontario and Quebec regions. For a distribution of what the ticks look like, this is what the distribution of Ixodes was in 1970 to 2000. And really what this study had done is an extrapolation of where they believe the ticks will be crawling to next. So an R0 of less than 1, so no color, anything greater than 1 would permit reproduction of the Ixodes ticks, not only in the populations of Ontario, and Quebec, but also in provinces such as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, where there were no viable breeding populations prior to that. So we can see as these projections move that the ticks definitely start to move into Canada, and they're definitely in the southern regions of many provinces. Now, I will say most of you are from the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island area. We're not leaving you out because there is actually a winter biting tick that is present that can spread Babesia. So the Ixodes pacificus species lives in the Lower Mainland, the Gulf Islands, and Vancouver Island, and it can bite year-round because of the temperate climate. And it actually spreads a different type of Babesia. So typically what we would see here is Babesia microti, but over on the West Coast, we see Babesia duncani, and both of these can cause babesiosis. So what have we done about this? Well, in 2018, we saw that the donor Babesia study, we took a donor blood from all across Canada. You can see each one of these dots represents a single donor that was tested for NAT, for Babesia. So this is looking for active infection where the parasite is in the blood. And we found a single positive in Manitoba. You can see this little red circle here. It's around the Winnipeg area. And so out of all of these, we found a single NAT positive. So it is possible in the donors that there is this parasitemia that goes undetected. So from that, there was a subset of these donors that were also screened for serology. And what we found, again, these green dots represent a single donor of where they reside, and the yellow dots in this case represent serology positive. So this means that donors would have past exposure to Babesia and that they have antibodies directed towards them. And we found a few donors right in the Kitchener area near the US border and near Detroit. But those were the only serology positives that we found. And so from this data, we know that from the 2018 study that our prevalence for Babesia is very low. It's 0.002 to 0.007. And in the states, there are some states that mandate Babesia testing of donors, and some that don't have to have Babesia testing because their prevalence rates are low. And our rates in Canada are several logs less than the prevalence of the recommended states. So for states that do have to test, their prevalence region ranges from 0.12 to 0.75. Since then, we've also had one confirmed case of Babesia transmission in Canada. And because of this combined, there was a risk-based decision-making process that was performed that really strongly emphasized that we do consistent monitoring and frequent testing of Babesia among the Canadian donors. So the epidemiology of the tick-borne transfusion-transmitted pathogens is definitely changing across Canada. You can see from those projections how the ticks are moving into new geographical areas, and we expect that this will continue. So our next step from Canadian Blood Services is to look at different areas of Canada for the prevalence of Babesia. So our first year, we looked at, this was in 2024, we looked at the entire population of Manitoba, and we took roughly 13,000 specimens and tested them. Last summer, we went to Nova Scotia, and particularly the area south of Yarmouth, and looked for Babesia prevalence there. This summer, we're going to be going to southern Ontario in the Windsor, London area, and then the following summer into the Kingston, Ottawa area. We are going to have the fifth summer where we're going to look for that winter biting tick, and this is going to be a Babesia duncani, but our assay looks for Babesia species, so it should pick up both microti and duncani. So what did we find? We found that in the surveillance of Manitoba, we did over 13,000 specimens, and none of them were positive for Babesia. So there is a very, very low chance that there is Babesia in Manitoba. You can see that we took the majority of our collections in the Winnipeg area where we found that previous positive, as well as the southern and the Interlake Eastern region, which is supposed to have a very high tick prevalence. But even though we did these very high prevalence areas, we still didn't find any NAT positives. This is consistent with what Manitoba sees for their clinical cases. So the signal for Babesia in Manitoba is very low clinically. There were only 2 clinical cases reported in that same time period for Manitoba, compared that to Lyme, where there are about 77 cases. But you can see generally the very, very low positives for Babesia in Manitoba, but they have seen a couple in more recent years. Likewise, for Lyme disease, it's increasing slightly as you get to more recent years of 2024 and 2023. What we found in our surveillance for Nova Scotia, and this was last summer, is that we tested a little over 10,000 specimens, and we found one NAT positive. Now, the rates for Lyme disease are a little bit higher in Nova Scotia as well as for Babesia. And we found the one positive in this western area. We took approximately 3,000 blood specimens from this area, and it was just the one positive that we found. You can see that there is a good stratification amongst age and gender, both females and males. But I think that this highlights that there could be a prevalent or a local possibility of Babesia transmission in these areas. This, again, just like the Manitoba data, correlated very well with where they're seeing clinical cases. So they saw one clinical case in the eastern area, one in the central area, and the majority, 9 cases, were from this western area that's south of Yarmouth. So what about other locations in Canada? Well, there were 3 clinical cases reported in Quebec in 2024. They looked at almost 30,000 samples from blood donors in Hemo-Quebec, and they all screened negative. I think importantly, only about 3,600 of those samples were from the high-risk Estrie region. But really together, these data suggest that while ongoing monitoring is needed to track these infections, and we are pulling up very low-level positives, it's not necessary to start routinely screening donors for Babesia infection. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about malaria, specifically in the US. So I think we forget historically that the US did have malaria present, but they did a huge mosquito eradication program that they removed the mosquitoes and they removed malaria, so that became non-endemic for malaria. However, after about 20 years, we're now starting to see cases that have been reported to the CDC. This started in 2023. And since then, it would also had cases in 2024 in Texas, Arkansas, and in Florida. And what happened is that individuals were positive for malaria with no travel history, so that they know that this is autochthonous spread. They've also detected it in the mosquito population itself and not just in humans. So this new emergence of malaria in the States, as well as a combined probable case of transfusion-transmitted malaria in Canada, has really made us look at malaria for donor screening. So in Canada, we had one suspected case of malaria transfusion. It was published in 2023. And basically what happened is there was an asymptomatic donor who turned out to have a very, very low parasitemia. And they donated blood, and it was given to an infant who subsequently developed malaria. The reason that this case is a probable case rather than confirmed is because the infant who had never left hospital, however, his mom had traveled back to an endemic area, so their mom was never able to be fully ruled out as the source of the malaria infection. However, the parasitemia was identified from the blood bags, and this was very, very low. So typically, when we see a clinical case of malaria, we're looking at 0.2 to 2% parasitemia. But on our donor with this probable case, there was a 0.0004%. Now, this is a very, very low level of malaria. And so if we're going to be able to detect malaria in our assays, we have to have a very, very sensitive assay for donor screening. However, there is new technology available. So in 2024, Health Canada FDA approved a molecular assay for blood donor screening. It's actually a ribosomal and DNA assay that allows detection of very low levels of parasitemia. So what we did at Canadian Blood Services is we gathered up a bunch of remnant samples that were collected from patients who did present with malaria-like symptoms. We got these from the provincial laboratory in Alberta. And we collected the parasitemia, the travel location, and the NAT result from the previous testing done at the provincial lab. We then used these samples, which were diluted into the proprietary Roche whole blood lysis tubes, and then we shipped them to our surveillance and discovery lab for testing. So what we found is that this assay is very, very sensitive. So if we look at our 95% LOD for the assay, for Plasmodium species, we're detecting levels down to just under 200 infected RBCs per mil, which is essentially equivalent to a 2.8 times 10 to the negative 6 parasitemia level. And if you look back at our probable transfusion transmitted malaria case, this is orders of magnitude more sensitive than would be needed to detect this assay or to detect that donor. So we're looking at a twofold log difference between the parasitemia of what our assay detected and what that specific donor had. This allows us to have a fairly significant change in donor screening because our overall goals for malaria screening are to change what is our current state. So our current state is if someone has had a history of malaria, it's an indefinite deferral. And if they've had a history of residency 3 years prior to donation and lived continuously in an endemic area for greater than 6 months, they're deferred for 3 years after departure from that endemic area. And this is enough to defer many donors from even coming back for donation. We estimate that this is greater than 2,000 deferrals annually. And so if we implement a malaria NAT test, this can change fairly significantly, where instead of indefinitely deferring donors, what we can do is, if it's a less than 6-month recovery, we would defer for a total of 6 months. But it's been greater than 6 months since they recovered, we can then accept them and test them by a malaria NAT assay. And this allows us to then bring those donors back into the donation fold. Similarly, with history of residence, if it's been less than 3 months, we would ask them to wait a total of 3 months before they came back. But after that 3 months, we can then accept them with a malaria NAT. And this would allow us to bring in a little over 2,000 donors a year. But it also allows us to then contact communities who may be more affected by the malaria deferral criteria and let them know that their eligibility has now been opened and that they're able to return for donation if they're interested. So overall, we know that emerging and re-emerging pathogens with known or theoretical risk of transfusion require monitoring. Because the climate change is allowing these vectors to move into new geographic areas, we're going to start to see these infections in areas that we didn't expect before. We know that Babesia remains a really low level in Canada, and currently at CBS, we don't recommend addition to the blood donor screening for Babesia. However, on the other hand, we are looking at implementation for malaria in early 2026 or late 2025, which will allow us to bring in a lot of more donors who were previously indefinitely deferred because they had a history of malaria. But really overall, understanding this local prevalence of transfusion transmissible pathogens is a really important part of surveillance to maintain the safety of the blood supply. So with that, I would like to thank the many people who have been involved in all of these studies, and particularly the organizers of the symposium. And with that, I am very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, interesting talk. So you stressed the effect of climate change on the proliferation of ticks, right, to northern hemispheres. But ticks are extremely thermal adaptable. And how do you discriminate between the climate change and the traveling of people? I mean, if you don't find ticks in an area where people don't travel, there's probably nothing to do with climate change, it's just by traveling, right? So how do you discriminate between the mobility of people, which tracks the ticks to other areas, and the 2-degree change in the last 150 years? If the ticks by themselves don't care about the temperature.
Correct. Yeah. So I missed the very beginning part of your question, but I think what you're asking is how do I differentiate between travel history of humans who are picking something up versus the movement of ticks?
Yeah, yeah.
So there are actually a lot of studies from entomology laboratories that will look at, and they basically do these screens for ticks in different regions. So they can test for Babesia of the actual ticks themselves. So we know From the maps that I showed with the progressing tick populations, those are from more entomology studies that have then tested the ticks themselves. So yes, you're right that we can't in the blood donors differentiate if it's a tick moving or they've just traveled somewhere. But from the movement of the ticks, we know that they are in those geographical areas from physical testing of the ticks. They actually collect the ticks and then test them.
Yeah. So then the correlation to climate change is very little.
Well, I mean, because it's movement. Oh, you're saying that the ticks are like...
They are highly adaptable to temperatures. They don't care plus minus 2 degrees.
Sure, yes. But I think that the birds that they are migrating on may change geography, and they can then go, you know, these are adventurous ticks. You're right. They could.
But maybe they're traveled by the humans, right?
Yes, that's possible.
Okay, question.
Hi, Carmen. I may have missed this from the beginning, but what are the symptoms of Babesia infection?
Generally, you can have something that's very flu-like, and I think a lot of people will experience that initially. And I think that's another reason why you see this long asymptomatic period, where someone will get like flu-like illness, general malaise, you know, something that you would experience with flu, and they write it off as a respiratory virus and don't think that that could be related to something long-term.
What do we know about hantaviruses and possible transfusion transmission and contamination in the blood, especially the more recent hantaviruses that may cause hemorrhages and fever?
Yeah, so hantavirus is generally transmitted through the feces of deer mice. And then when it's aerosolized, the classic example is when you are cleaning out your cabin, you're sweeping, and you're making a lot of aerosols that include mouse droppings. Hantavirus also has a long asymptomatic period, but the viremia is highest when you have symptoms of hantavirus. And that's one of the reasons why screening for hantavirus NAT testing is not even done as a screening test, because the viremia doesn't come until you see symptoms. And that's when we would do testing in the clinical setting.
Just to comment back on the symptomology of babesiosis, that one case that we identified in Nova Scotia was a donor who was actually managed for Lyme disease. So Ixodes in that area also carries the bacteria that causes Lyme and anaplasma as well. And after management, he had this grumbling kind of a malaise that went on for several weeks. So it can be very nonspecific, and in some cases, completely asymptomatic.
Thanks, Steve. That's a good point.
Hi, Dr. Carmen. Thank you very much for this talk. Just from a curiosity standpoint, the map that you highlighted, I'm wondering, is South Asia no longer a huge carrier of these viruses? Because I guess I thought that a lot of these viruses are endemic to South Asia as well. So just curious.
You're absolutely right. I didn't actually highlight where they normally are distributed. So obviously malaria is going to be in Africa, and I only put in where they're really newly emerging. So yes, the typical areas like for dengue are not highlighted. It's just the new autochthonous threat that I highlighted.
Got it. Thank you.
So I'm a wealthy Canadian. I travel a lot, so I live in Canada, but I go to other places. I get a blood transfusion, and then sometime remote to the transfusion, I get a viral-like illness. Should I present specifically for testing?
If you've gone...
Basically, you travel, and you go to areas where these things are endemic. then you have a blood transfusion here for medical reasons, and downstream you get what appears to be a viral infection. Should this person turn up and get specifically screened? It's a question of how you find your cases, basically. I mean, population screening is difficult, but an individual with symptomatic, that might be one way of detecting your cases.
Oh, are you talking about Babesia?
Any of them, quite honestly, but yeah, Babesia, yes, certainly.
Oh, okay. So for blood donor screening, for most areas except for the US and Western Europe, we have a 21-day travel deferral. So most of the cases, we won't even pick up an acute infection for any of these, because the majority of the time the incubation period is past that. So we rely on our public health colleagues to be able to look for clinical cases when people are actually symptomatic.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just want to pick up on the point that Dr. Brommer raised before. If a traveller comes back from a country where they were bitten by a tick and had a virus or a bacteria transmitted to them, and they come back to a colder climate, southern Canada, how often could those infected individuals, what's the chance of them then being bitten by a tick and the bug going to the to the tick, and then the tick propagating it through the population of ticks, i.e. reverse transmission?
Right. It actually depends on the pathogen. So for like West Nile virus, for example, the viremia is much higher in birds, and it normally maintains a sylvatic cycle. But humans do have a very short viremia where it could technically be picked up by mosquitoes in those areas. So the duration and the possibility is really pathogen dependent.
For the ones responsible for Lyme disease?
Well, Lyme disease is not transfusion transmittable, but for things like Babesia, that is transfusion transmittable, you could have a parasitemia that is transmitted.
Sorry, I don't mean for transfusions. I'm talking about the point that was raised about climate change and traveling populations. Then the traveled infected population then being a source for ticks or mosquitoes for that to spread through the community as a way of transmitting. Or the alternative hypothesis is that with climate change, the mosquitoes and the ticks are actually moving north.
I can answer a bit of that. So after the American Revolutionary War, they brought a bunch of soldiers from the Caribbean and India into the Niagara Peninsula, and the mosquitoes were there, and the soldiers had Plasmodium vivax, and there was an establishment of Plasmodium vivax in that population, in the mosquitoes as well as in people who would occasionally have hypnozoites that would reactivate. So it is possible to have that happen, but that's a good example of that. In many cases, though, what we're probably seeing is, if you look at Nova Scotia, that the activity area is right near the Bay of Fundy. That's where a huge amount of birds go every year, and they're probably taking Ixodes ticks from Massachusetts or areas and bringing them in, and then there's a cycle that establishes there. And it's probably in mice and deer at the start, and then it moves into the population. So you're seeing less going back into human. What you're probably seeing is the extirpation of specific mice species, the establishment of mice populations that are going to be picking up these Ixodes ticks, the establishment in mice and deer, and then the movement into humans as they get exposed to ticks that have been with this mouse-deer cycle.
Carmen, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.